Hello, everyone.
Hello. I
Good to
enjoyed the
see you.
video you sent.
Hi, Professor.
How are you doing tonight? That's good. That's good. Any questions about anything?
Is the podcast due on the 7th?
No. If you want it, if you're ready to have it due on the 7th, yes. I was thinking more toward what. So, have you been working on it?
I know our group is going to record after this class, so I
Okay.
didn't know how long we'd have to edit it.
Well, yeah. Well, okay. Do other people have the 7th in mind? That would be great. Okay, let's do the 7th. And thank you for asking, Lizette. I look forward to hearing your group. So,
Okay.
good.
That's what I thought we talked about earlier, so I was
Okay.
just clarifying.
So I have set up the Buzzsprout piece, Revolutionary Rams. So that's what you'll be doing. And send me the audio file and I will post it. And then we can start cranking it out to social media. Good. Very good. Other questions? So where did I leave off last time? So this time was only 2 days, so I'm hoping people have a clearer recollection of where we were.
We were about to talk about the Sedition Acts.
Oh, okay. The Sedition Acts. Good.
Touched on the XYZ affair,
The
a little bit of
XYZ.
Washington's second term.
Okay. Sean is good. He's really, I had a student last semester then told me at the end that she just looked at her notes. Actually, she might have looked at the recording from the last class, the last few minutes, just to see where we left off. So good. Maybe that's what Sean has done. Okay, so we have the XYZ affair, and then we have Congress responding with the Alien Sedition Act, creating a provisional army in case the French invade. And for a commander of the provisional army, who would you have in mind?
Washington.
Of course, Washington. And Washington agrees, but Alexander Hamilton convinces him he only should take the job if Hamilton is his second in command. As Alexander Hamilton, as you probably know from the musical, liked to dress up in a uniform and lead people around and give orders on the battlefield. So Hamilton will be the second in command. And since Washington is not in that great a shape, this makes it, Hamilton is going to be commanding this 10,000 man army to put down the French invasion. And the Alien and Sedition Acts, the Alien Act, there are two of them, remember, friends and enemies. And to my knowledge, the Alien Enemies Act was never actually enforced because, to be honest, most French people who were here took the opportunity of leaving. There was one French character, in fact, the law was particularly aimed at, and this was, well, we don't need to talk about him. The Abbé Volney, who was wandering around the country, and he seemed to be, well, we don't need to talk about the Abbé Volney, interesting as he is. And the alien friends, well, we'll talk about the Sedition Act, because this makes it a federal offense to write, publish, or utter, or cause to be written, published, or uttered anything that might bring the president, a member of Congress, a member of the court, a member of the military into contempt, hatred, or ridicule. And Timothy Pickering, the Secretary of State, really knows that most of the Republican newspapers, that is the opposition newspapers, feed off of the same sources. And that is they're republishing things. So something that's published in the Philadelphia Aurora is going to find its way into the Boston Sentinel or into the other opposition newspapers. So a good way of shutting it all down is to shut off the sources. So he really goes after the big papers to shut down the source. And overall, something like 14 or 15 of the newspaper editors are charged with sedition and arrested and then put on trial. And the trials happen all around the country. One of the most interesting trials, though, is not the newspaper publisher, but a member of Congress. And this is Matthew Lyon, who was a congressman from Vermont. And forgive me if I've already told you the story of Matthew Lyon, the congressman from Vermont, or if you've heard the story before. Has anyone heard the story before of Matthew Lyon, congressman from Vermont? I'm looking nervously at people who've been in my classes before because I think I've probably told it, or it might have just been the guys I was talking to at a tavern the other night. I was telling Sean, you were about to say something about Matthew Lyon?
I was gonna say can't say I've ever heard anything about him.
Oh, okay, well, that's good. That's reassuring. He was an Irish immigrant. That is, he had come to this country from Ireland sometime in the 1750s or so, and made his way up to Vermont, which then was the New Hampshire grants. And he had been in the Continental Army for a time until when he finally got to see action. It turned out he was not quite up to the task, and he was court-martialed for cowardice. And in those days, if you were court-martialed and drummed out of the service for cowardice, we would be made to wear a wooden sword so everyone could see you were a coward. Okay, but notwithstanding that, and I'm not faulting Mr. Lyon for not being a very good officer, for being a coward, since I've never actually been in the military myself and don't know what I would do in a similar situation. He goes on to become a newspaper editor in Vermont, and by the 1790s, he is a member of Congress, and he is he's a Republican member of Congress, part of the opposition. Now, Vermont was quite a radical state then. Connecticut was one of the most federal states in the country. Connecticut is very much federalist. Connecticut and Massachusetts both are. And one day in Congress, this is in Philadelphia, Matthew Lyon and a group of Republican congressmen are standing around talking. Ainsley, I think you know this story. They're talking, and Lyon says, if I went to Connecticut, I could turn it Republican in 6 weeks. And a member of Congress from Connecticut, a Federalist, overhears this and says, well, if you come to Connecticut, be sure to wear your wooden sword, which of course Lyon knows is a great insult. He's reminding everyone that 20 years earlier, he had been kicked out of the Army for being a coward. Now here he is bragging about turning Connecticut Republican. So wear your wooden sword. So I don't know what you would do if you were insulted like this. Jake, what would you do if you are insulted by a member of Congress who reminds everyone that you're court-martialed for cowardice and you're a big blowhard and don't really know what you're talking about?
Probably punch him in the face.
Okay, you might. And if maybe that would be the better thing to do. And maybe this just illustrates that Mr. Lyon actually was a coward because he doesn't punch Congressman Griswold. He spits in his face. Now, at this point, I don't need to ask what you would do if you were Congressman Griswold. You do then punch Lyon in the face. And these two members of Congress start fighting each other. They happen to be standing near a fireplace, and each of them grabs the fire tongs and are starting to whack each other with these. These two guys are brawling on the floor of Congress, and their partisans from each side have to pull them apart and separate them. Now, immediately, there is a call from the Republicans to expel Griswold because he insulted Lyon. And the Federalists say, no, you have to expel Lyon because he spit in Griswold's face. And the Republicans say, well, he spit in his face because he insulted him. You can see this kind of back and forth isn't going to go well, it is going to go somewhere. Each side is going to think, we can't deal with the other. The Federalists say you have to expel Lyon. The Republicans say you can't expel Lyon without expelling Griswold too. And the Republicans aren't going to allow Lyon to be expelled from Congress. The Federalists aren't going to allow Griswold to be expelled from Congress. I was going to show you the political cartoon of the time of these two guys fighting in Congress. I know it's hard to picture members of Congress today having such a vociferous dislike for each other that something like this might happen, a dislike that's really bred in a partisan difference. But Lyon stays in Congress. However, he is something of a marked man. And in 1798, remember, the Sedition Act had passed in July. in November, there's going to be an election for Congress. And in the course of the election, Lyon sends a circular letter to his constituents saying, well, he said, I read the president's speech and I couldn't believe that the Senate's response was not to send him to a madhouse. And also said that when he saw the Adams administration turning good, honest people out of office simply because they weren't toadying to the absurd monarchical ambitions of John Adams, who had a ridiculous pomp and parade and other things. So somehow this circular letter falls into the hands of Secretary of State Pickering. Actually, I'll tell you how it does that. The guy running against Lyon sends it to the Secretary of State and says, isn't he trying to bring President Adams into contempt, hatred, and ridicule? And of course, Pickering says he is. So Lyon is indicted and charged with sedition, put on trial up in Vermont. The presiding judge is William Patterson, who's a justice of the Supreme Court. And at his trial, Lyon tries to act as his own counsel. And Benjamin Franklin had said that a man who serves as his own counsel has a fool for a client and an ass for a lawyer. So just remember that if you ever decide to argue your own case in court. And Lyon, one thing the Sedition Act does, it allows you to use truth as a defense. So in that regard, it is actually a step forward for civil liberties. So at his trial, Lyon tries to show that President Adams' administration is one full of pomp and ridiculous pomp and parade. And he is turning good, honest people out of office because they won't toady to him. And the court doesn't buy it. So Lyon winds up going to jail for 4 months. Here's another case. This one happens in New Jersey, in Newark. And after the congressional session ended toward the middle of July, President Adams was heading home to Braintree. Well, by this time he's heading home to Quincy. Quincy became a city in 1793. I know there's no one here from Quincy, or else he would have immediately jumped up and said, no, it wasn't Braintree any longer. It was Quincy. And Adams is on his way home, and the citizens all along the route knew the president was going to be passing through. And remember, we're going to war with France. And this is a moment when people are coming to want to be part of this war against the French foe. And they want to show their support for the president. In fact, it's this period when the song Hail to the Chief is introduced as a way of greeting the president. Now, the Glee Club in Newark had not learned the words to Hail to the Chief, but they had written a song about here comes the president at whose commands we obey, that they're going to sing for President Adams. And all the local dignitaries had prepared speeches to deliver when the president came, so each of them could show the president how much they support what he is doing. So this was going to be a big day for Newark. And Newark, then as now, would need a big day now and then. And the arrival and visitation of the president would be a great moment for Newark. So all of the dignitaries have gathered on Market Street in Newark. They have a cannon. They're going to fire a salute. The Glee Club is ready, and they're waiting all morning. And then they see a cloud of dust off in the distance, and it's the president on his horse riding along, heading toward them. They prepare. The little band strikes up its song. The Glee Club starts to sing, so the president will hear them as he slows and stops, and then they can begin their speeches and show the president how much they support the effort against the French. And the president approaches. The president gets closer, and he's right here, and he keeps going. President Adams is in a hurry to get home. He didn't like spending one more day than he had to in Philadelphia. And so he was anxious to get home, and he knew if he stopped at every little town along the way and listened to speeches, he would never get home. He would have to turn right around and go back. So there he goes. Well, so what do you do now if you're the citizens of Newark? They decide what they should do is fire the salute, since he will be able to hear that. And on his way now, they'll be able to hear off in the distance the cannon of Newark firing a salute. So they start firing the cannon. This springs out of a nearby tavern, a couple of local citizens who had spent the morning, refreshing themselves in anticipation of the president's visit. And so now it's noonday. These two guys come out of the tavern and they are pretty well lubricated. And they hear the cannon shooting. They see the cloud of dust that is President Adams disappearing over the horizon. And one says, "Look, there goes the president, and they're shooting at his ass." And the other one says, "I don't care if they shoot through his ass." And this, of course, got a great laugh. I see Lizette laughing, and people there who are waiting all day for the president to arrive now see these two guys laughing at the president. And the sedition law does say if you bring the president into ridicule, you can be charged with sedition. And sure enough, President Adams had been brought into ridicule by these two miscreants. So they're charged with sedition. And of course, the newspapers, which are not supportive of John Adams, have difficulty finding ways of criticizing the law or the president or members of Congress. But now they do have a way of, well, they say it's a good thing these two guys were charged because we don't want any part of this dear man to be brought into ridicule. And someone points out that in England, you are permitted to talk about the king's head, but in America, you cannot criticize the president's ass. And if you know anything about Adams, you know that that was a relatively large part of his anatomy. So these two guys charged with sedition for criticizing president or causing people to laugh at his vanishing ass over the horizon. So all in all, these two are something of an exception. 14 others are charged with sedition and sent to jail. Now, while Matthew Lyon, by the way, is in jail up in Vermont, he's actually reelected to Congress. Now, one thing President Adams knows how to do is count. And he thinks, well, maybe this isn't the best way to counter sedition. And we'll get to this in a bit. By the way, a number of years ago, I happened to meet with a very charming lady named Abigail, who was a descendant of the Adamses. And of course, she was named for her illustrious ancestor. And she said, "I have been having the Alien and Sedition Acts thrown in my face since I was in 3rd grade." And so she was genuinely tired of that. And I can understand it because John Adams wasn't the guy who created the Sedition Act. It was the Congress. So that's at least the Adams family position on that particular story. Okay, but let's get back to the political opposition, which has pretty much been shut down. And remember, in 1798 and in 1800, we're going to have elections for Congress during which it will be against the law to say anything that might bring a member of Congress into contempt, hatred, or ridicule. And in 1800, there's going to be an election for president in which you will not be allowed by federal law to say anything which might bring the president into contempt, hatred, or ridicule. How would you run a political campaign under those particular constraints? And the leaders of the opposition are wondering, is the real aim here to protect the country from the French, or is it to ensure that all opposition is removed from the government? And what can you do about this? And Thomas Jefferson, who is the vice president and the only federal official whom it is permissible to criticize or bring into contempt, hatred, or ridicule, calls this the reign of the witches. And he says, with some patience, this reign of the witches will pass away. But just to be safe, in case it doesn't, Jefferson writes a series of resolutions, which he sends to a colleague, John Breckinridge, who is a member of the Kentucky legislature. And the resolutions the state of Kentucky adopt say that the Alien and Sedition Acts are an unconstitutional violation of the federal compact, that the federal government does not have this power to restrict freedom of speech or to restrict the people the states might want to admit. And when the federal government exceeds its constitutional powers, the states have the power to interpose their authority against intrusive federal acts and nullify federal laws. Kentucky adopts this. And meanwhile, in Virginia, James Madison comes out of his retirement, runs for the Virginia legislature, and he proposes, and Virginia adopts, a series of resolutions that say when the federal government exceeds its constitutional powers, the states can object, the states collectively. He doesn't say Virginia can say we don't want to enforce these laws, but the states have a constitutional role here in making sure the federal government doesn't exceed its powers. Because here you have the Congress passing a law, the president signing the law and now enforcing it. And remember, each of the trials under the Sedition Act was heard by a justice of the Supreme Court. And none of them had any issue with the Sedition Act as a violation of the First Amendment. Remember, the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. And Madison, in his report to the Virginia legislature, said, what is the Sedition Act but a law that abridges the freedom of the press? I'm surprised none of you mentioned this. If we were in a classroom, I know someone would have raised his or her hand and said, well, what about the First Amendment, which does guarantee a free press? And I'll tell you that at least one justice of the Supreme Court, James Wilson, said, the freedom of the press does not mean the freedom to write anything seditious. Freedom of the press means freedom from prior restraint. In Britain, if you want to print something that is critical of the government, first you have to get permission and the government can stop it. This is prior restraint. And William Blackstone, who wrote commentaries on the law of England, had said that freedom of the press essentially means freedom from prior restraint. And this was the understanding that the learned justices of the Supreme Court had, that yes, there is no prior restraint here, that is freedom of the press. But if you write something that is seditious or libelous, then you can be punished for it. Now, James Madison, for his part, takes this whole idea, by the way, Virginia and Kentucky passed the resolutions knowing that the federal government really can't shut down the legislatures of two states. They send them to the other states and say, what do you think? And every other state says, no, that's not what we think. We think, yes, the federal government has the power to pass these laws and you should stop complaining. So Virginia and Kentucky are kind of alone, but Madison really thinks either I am wrong about what freedom of the press means, or they're wrong. And Madison comes to see that freedom of the press means something different from freedom from prior restraint. How can you have a political society based on this idea that the majority rules and not let the majority discuss things, not let people discuss things? That is, in order to have a free country, you need to have a free press. So Madison in 1800 writes a defense of the Virginia resolutions and argues for an idea of the freedom of the press, which no one pays any attention to until 1907, when a case comes before the Supreme Court from Colorado. A newspaper editor in Colorado had a running feud with the Colorado Supreme Court, and his paper carried a number of political cartoons attacking the Colorado Supreme Court. And if there's anyone who's sensitive about the way they're depicted in newspapers, it's judges. And if you think that your case might wind up in court, you better not attack the justices of your state Supreme Court because they find Mr. Patterson guilty of sedition and put him away. And the case comes before the Supreme Court of the United States, and there the Supreme Court of the United States says, well, good enough, he got what he deserved. Except one justice dissents, and this is a justice who had read James Madison's report of 1800 and says, no, this isn't what freedom of the press means. And it is that idea of the freedom of the press that 10 years later becomes the underlying idea the court will use in 1918. So it takes 118 years for this idea of Madison's to become the understanding of freedom of the press, which is why you can say whatever you want. Well, I have seen people say whatever they want about presidents of all kinds over the course of my long life. So I'm not quite sure if any of them is happy with this turn of events, but this is how it plays out. In this case, 1798, no, freedom of the press means freedom from prior restraint. And so if you've had the temerity to criticize President Adams, you are going to go to jail for it. Okay, so meanwhile, back in France, not surprisingly, the French government, which, by the way, the French are attacking American ships in the Caribbean. And the American fleet, consisting of a few frigates, is in the Mediterranean fighting the French. And by 1799, the French government realizes this is a distraction for us. If we really want to fight the English, we probably should patch things up with the Americans. The problem for the French is the Americans don't really believe this. And there's really no clear way for them to get the message to the Americans. There is a fellow from Pennsylvania named George Logan who happens to go visiting in France, and members of the French government pull him aside and say, you know what, we would really like to negotiate with the Americans. And Logan says, oh, maybe I can go talk to people I know back in Philadelphia. And in fact, he knows President Adams. So he wants to go meet with President Adams and tell him what he has heard from his friends in France. And do you know what happens to Mr. Logan? Has anyone heard of a piece of legislation called the Logan Act? Named for him. So he has a law named for him, and it's not like a law in honor of someone. The law actually makes it a federal offense for a private citizen to try to engage in diplomatic work. And so the Logan Act will punish Mr. Logan by sending him to jail for talking to the enemy and pretending to be negotiating. So if you ever find yourself in a hostile environment, that is a country hostile to the United States, don't try to undertake diplomacy on behalf of the United States, because it will end badly, definitely for you, quite likely for the United States and the country you're trying to patch things up with. So there's another valuable lesson for today. I hope that someone is keeping track of all the important things you're learning thanks to this particular class. So the other thing is, remember the negotiators that the United States had sent, Marshall and Pinckney, have come home. Elbridge Gerry still is hanging out in Europe, and the French contact Gerry and say, we really think the war was a mistake. We would like to patch things up. And Gerry relays this to President Adams. And so President Adams convenes his cabinet and says, I've heard from Mr. Gerry that the French really want to patch things up. And the cabinet says, of course, Gerry is a Republican. Of course he would say that. We didn't think he should have gone in the first place. So they're not going to listen to Elbridge Gerry, who is a diplomat. They can't charge him because he is there actually in an official capacity. So it's slow going for Adams to convince his cabinet and the Congress that maybe the French really want to make peace. And then he hears from another source, and this is the American consul in Berlin, an American diplomat who is in Berlin, and the French have contacted him, or he's kept an eye on what's happening in France, and he writes to the president and says, the French really do want to make peace. And this is someone, if Adams tells his cabinet, I had heard from someone else that the French sincerely want to make peace, they can't tell Adams not to listen to, because this is John Quincy Adams. This is the president's son. And President Adams has, as anyone should, an implicit trust in what his son is telling him. And not only is he his son, he is John Quincy Adams, a man of unimpeachable integrity. So Adams now knows the French seriously want to make peace. And so Adams now summons, he's back in New Jersey. By the way, during this entire period, Philadelphia was every couple of years hit with a devastating outbreak of yellow fever. In fact, in 1793, 10% of the people of Philadelphia died of yellow fever. And the government had to leave town. And no one knew what caused this disease. There had been an immigration of French refugees from the West Indies. So there was some thought that maybe it is these French people from the West Indies. Of course, also a lot of African Americans had actually Afro-Caribbeans had come into Philadelphia as part of this French exodus. One of the things that happens in the wake of the French Revolution is a civil war in Haiti. And there are French refugees coming with their formerly enslaved people into Philadelphia. But there is there's actually some medical evidence that people from Africa don't get yellow fever. And then this is partially true. Africans in West Africa who have been exposed to yellow fever as children will be immune to it. But African Americans who have not been exposed to yellow fever won't be. And what happens in Philadelphia are a couple of things, well, a number of things. You have 10% of the population dying and whole families dying of this fever, mainly in the poorer sections of the city, in the areas nearest the docks. And the fact that a lot of the people are dying near the docks gives rise to another theory about what causes this terrible disease. One of these ships from the West Indies has arrived, and it is loaded with coffee and other things. And all of this stuff has been unloaded on the docks, but then there is no one around to come cart it to market or buy it. So you have this cargo of coffee and other stuff rotting on the docks. So another medical theory emerges that the disease is caused by rotting coffee on the docks. And maybe if we did something to clean that up, it would stop the spread of the disease. It doesn't. By the way, it's going to be another 100 years before anyone realizes what causes yellow fever. Do any of you know what causes yellow fever?
Is it spread by mosquitoes?
Yes,
Malaria.
a certain type of mosquito. Yes, yeah. So a certain type of mosquito spreads yellow fever, and we didn't know that, of course, in 1793. Now, one other thing that happens is the Black community in Philadelphia volunteers to help tend to the sick. And they do. And there's a Black church in Philadelphia. The Bishop William Allen and his congregation really take charge of getting people to hospitals. In fact, a new hospital opens. By the way, the leading medical authority of the time in Philadelphia was Dr. Benjamin Rush. And Benjamin Rush, by the way, was the one who said it's the rotting coffee on the docks. And Rush also thinks the best way to treat yellow fever is to bleed people. Which was a traditional way of treating people for all kinds of things, because there was this medical idea that your body contains these different fluids that have to be kept in balance. And just about any kind of an ailment was caused by an imbalance of fluid. So if you have an imbalance of fluid, all you have to do is drain off some. So you would drain off people's blood. And this was the way it was thought we can cure people, by bloodletting. This is why barbers used to have leeches, because barbers not only would cut hair, they would also attach leeches to you I'm sorry, Lizette was just taking a nice drink, and here I'm talking about leeches and taking off blood so that your body will be in balance. And I should tell you, this is not a way to cure yellow fever. If someone is suffering from yellow fever, they do need a lot of fluids, and they do need rest, and bloodletting is not going to cure them. Anyway, we got kind of distracted with this whole story. Needless to say, yellow fever hits Philadelphia, so the government will move out of Philadelphia. And in 1799, actually, by this time, President Adams is meeting with the officers of the government in New Jersey, and he's heard from Elbridge Gerry, and the members of his administration said, no, you can't trust that guy. And then he hears from his son, and Adams decides he really needs to send a new mission to France to make peace and suspend all of these various war preparations. Now, when his cabinet hears about this, they're quite upset, because they wanted to have this, they thought it was a serious threat. The French pose a serious threat and we need to counter them. And his Secretary of State, Timothy Pickering, comes to tell Adams, you don't know what you're doing. Suspending the war, wanting to suspend the army, to do all these other things when we're about to go to war with France. And Adams tells Pickering that, well, he actually tells Pickering, you're fired. And Pickering gets very upset with this, and he goes to tell the Secretary of the Treasury that Adams just fired me. Can he do that? And the Secretary of the Treasury, Mr. Wolcott, goes to see President Adams, said, what were you doing firing Pickering? And Adams says, you know what, you're fired too. By the way, Adams did have a reputation for being hot-headed and making these impetuous decisions. And then they go and tell Alexander Hamilton. Of course, Hamilton is the intellectual leader of the Federalists, and in many ways, their political leader. I'm trying to remember if there is a song about this scene in the musical. There really should be, because Hamilton goes to complain to Adams about, I've heard you're going to disband the army. And Adams says, yes, I am. By the way, Adams never liked Hamilton. These two guys really hated each other. And in fact, Adams referred to Hamilton as that bastard son of a bitch and other. By the way, I'm sorry for all the profanity tonight. I'm not quite sure what's gotten into me. Don't tell the dean. Okay. Anyway, I'm just quoting the historical record, actually. And Hamilton says, what happens if the French invade? And Adams says, there's as much chance of the French invading heaven as invading America. And he then cans Hamilton, which also really irks Alexander Hamilton. And we'll get back to what Hamilton does in retaliation next. But anyway, and Adams, by the late summer of 1800, his administration has made peace with France, signed a convention. The French government agrees we're not going to attack American ships anymore. The United States says, okay. And so Adams establishes peace with France. Great moment. This is, by the way, why he will call his home in Quincy Peacefield. Now, you would think, wouldn't you, that here you're President Adams, and you've been able to send the newspaper editors who have been attacking you to jail. So you have pretty much a one-sided press in your favor. And the big foreign policy, the big problem of your administration, war with France, you've settled. You would think in this case that if you're President Adams, you're probably going to get reelected. Also, it's still a federal offense for anyone to say anything critical of you, which would also really increase your opportunity to be reelected. But it doesn't go well for President Adams. And the first real warning sign was in April. And New York still had its presidential electors chosen by the legislature. And in April, the voters of New York go to the polls and they turn out the legislature they'd elected a year earlier, all Federalists. And now, thanks to the work of Aaron Burr, elect a mainly Republican legislature, which means this legislature is going to cast the New York's president. The legislature is going to choose presidential electors in November, and they are going to choose Republicans as presidential electors, which means John Adams is not going to carry New York. And this greatly alarms Alexander Hamilton, not because he thinks John Adams needs to carry New York. Hamilton is already thinking about getting someone to replace Adams. I'll tell you what he's doing. I don't know if I should tell you now or tell you after I tell you what happens with Governor Jay in New York. By the way, this is one of these critical moments in the history of the Republic when you can see things going differently and having a different outcome. Hamilton realizes the Republicans are going to carry New York. What we should do to prevent that is change the law. So he writes to Governor Jay and says, call back into session the legislature that was elected last year. It's all Federalists. Have them change the law so that they choose the presidential electors rather than have this group elected now, who are all Republicans, choose the electors. So what would you do if you're Governor Jay? And you're also a Federalist. You also don't want a Republican elected president. And do you call in the legislature, change the law? This is one of these critical moments. Which way are we going to go here? Are we going to allow Jefferson, whom we regard as the Antichrist, to be elected? Or will we have New York change the law and cast its votes for a Federalist? I don't know if any of you has a "What would John Jay do" bracelet, but I'll be selling them after class.
I imagine changing the law for a specific election would be pretty dodgy, really. Like that would set a pretty bad precedent. But
It would set a terrible precedent. Yes, exactly, it would. But then again, would you want to have Thomas Jefferson as president? By the way, James gets a gold star for saying that this would set a terrible precedent. And so John Jay actually never answers the letter, doesn't even respond to it. He's not going to change the law to get a different outcome in the election, okay? So New York is going to go for the Republicans, but Hamilton isn't through, by the way. Hamilton, right, and again, I'm pretty sure this wasn't covered in the musical, and I don't want you to think I'm obsessed with Lin-Manuel Miranda. I keep thinking, my wife keeps asking, wouldn't any of your books make good rap musicals? Could you do something with one of them? And the problem is I just don't have the talent. So other than that, I think they probably would. Anyway, getting back to Hamilton, he really thinks that John Adams is temperamentally unfit to be president. Because of course, Adams had just fired him in this big, flash of emotion. And Hamilton doesn't think the president should be giving these big flashes of emotion. It's very unpresidential. And so Hamilton writes a letter to the Federalist electors saying John Adams is temperamentally unfit to be president. And you really shouldn't vote for him. You should vote for someone like Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, the guy who had said millions for defense, not 1 cent for tribute, guy from South Carolina, real stand-up guy. There's not yet a street name for him on Beacon Hill, but there will be. And so Hamilton writes a long letter explaining how bad Adams is, how temperamentally unfit he is. He's a man of violent passion, uncontrollable temper, other things you don't want in a president. And he sends this to a number of Federalist electors so that they will know, boy, we had thought Adams was the president, but it turns out he's really not fit for the job. Now, a copy of the letter falls into the hands of Aaron Burr. And Burr thinks that more people than a handful of presidential electors would probably like to know what the intellectual leader of the Federalist Party thinks about their political leader. And so Burr has this published. And so everyone gets to read what Hamilton really thinks of John Adams, which raises a question among some folks who are reading this, that why isn't Hamilton now charged with sedition, since he's writing something that's going to bring the president to contempt, hatred, or ridicule? Well, the answer is by this time, Adams has stopped enforcing the sedition law, and he's instead running for re-election, having made peace with France. So that's where things are, but the election does not go well for President Adams. And in fact, it is a very close election. And by a matter of 3 electoral votes, Thomas Jefferson is elected president. So very close election, very narrowly won by Jefferson. In fact, Adams was at the White House. The government had just moved to Washington in 1800. And Adams is at the executive mansion, which was still unfinished. And he's getting news from around the country, and he gets a report in late December from Kentucky that the votes of Kentucky have gone to Jefferson. And he knows he is not going to be elected. or reelected as president. And by the way, about this time that Adams writes one of the most touching letters in the entire Adams repertoire. And I know many of you did look into the Adams letters earlier. And this one is a letter to Abigail. This is shortly after he's arrived at this unfinished executive mansion. And he knows he is not going to be there beyond March the 4th. And his letter closes saying, "Before I close, let me call down the blessings of heaven on this house and on all who may hereafter live here. May none but good and wise men rule under this roof." And he knows he's not going to be one of them. By the way, that final paragraph is inscribed on the fireplace in the East Room of the White House as a reminder to everyone who holds the office. Now, meanwhile, though, there is something of a problem here with the election. You'll recall, well, back in 1796, when Jefferson and Burr had been the Republican candidates for president and vice president, not all of the Republican electors voted for Aaron Burr. In fact, all of the Virginia electors voted for Thomas Jefferson and Samuel Adams. And Burr knows that, well, Burr is a good politician, a very smart politician. And again, if you've seen the musical, you know this. He's also a grandson of Jonathan Edwards, the great New England theologian. And his father, whose name was also Aaron Burr, was president of Princeton and married Jonathan Edwards' daughter. Edwards had been president of Princeton. And so Burr is the son and grandson of presidents of Princeton, as well as congregational ministers. It's a great pedigree. And Aaron Burr does not go into either the ministry or academia. He goes into politics, and he is a very good politician. And as a very good politician, he knows how to count. He also knows how to get favors from people and make bargains. And he had made a bargain with the Republicans that he would deliver New York, and they were supposed to deliver Virginia. And then the Virginians don't vote for him. So what's that all about? So 1800, James Madison, who is running the campaign, makes sure all of the Republican electors vote for Thomas Jefferson and for Aaron Burr. And so then in early February, when the electors meet, and Vice President Jefferson is the presiding officer in Congress, this, by the way, is still how it is done. Both houses of Congress meet, the vice president presides, they count the electoral votes, and then the vice president announces the result. And in this case, the result is 71 votes for Thomas Jefferson, 71 votes for Aaron Burr, 68 votes for John Adams, 59 votes for Thomas Pinckney, 1 vote for John Jay, and who is president? The vice president then will declare who the winner is and who won.
Jefferson.
But Burr got the same number of votes. The electors at this time voted for 2 people. The person who gets the highest number is the president. Here you have a tie. You have 2 people who got the same number of votes. And now the Federalists, who really did not want to see Jefferson as president, see an opportunity to prevent that from happening. What happens when there is a tie or no one has a majority is that the House of Representatives chooses from among the top vote getters, and each state will have 1 vote. And on the first ballot, let's see, New Hampshire, all 4 of the congressmen from New Hampshire vote for Aaron Burr. So New Hampshire goes for Burr. Massachusetts, 11 votes for Burr, 3 for Jefferson. Every Federalist member of Congress is going to vote for Aaron Burr to be president. The Republicans are going to vote for Jefferson. Rhode Island votes for Burr, Connecticut for Burr. Vermont is divided. Matthew Lyon is a Republican. The other member of Congress is a Federalist, so Vermont does not cast a vote. New York, 6 votes for Jefferson, 4 for Burr. New Jersey, 3 for Jefferson, 2 for Burr. Pennsylvania, 9 for Jefferson, 4 for Burr. Delaware, 1 vote for Aaron Burr. Maryland, again, is divided. Virginia, 14 for Jefferson, 5 for Burr. North Carolina goes for Jefferson. South Carolina goes for Burr. The states that have a majority of Federalists in their delegation vote for Aaron Burr. Georgia goes for Jefferson, Kentucky for Jefferson, Tennessee for Jefferson. So 52 members of Congress vote for Aaron Burr, 48 for Thomas Jefferson, but we're going by state, and it is 6 for Burr, 8 for Jefferson, 2 are divided, and they keep voting for the next 2 weeks. They have 36 ballots, as the Federalists are hoping that the Republicans give up. And we can have Burr, because Burr is a guy we can make deals with. Jefferson, they think, is this mad ideologue. He's a disciple of the French Revolution. Do you know, by the way, Jefferson wrote a book called Notes on the State of Virginia, and in it he asked rhetorically, what harm does it do me if my neighbor believes there is no God or there are 20 gods? It neither breaks my arm nor picks my pocket. Do you want a guy who is such a flagrant non-Christian being president? Imagine that. He doesn't care if his neighbor believes there's no God or there are 20 gods. There are stories of pious New England women burying their Bibles for fear that Jefferson is going to have them confiscated. And so I can see many reasons why you might want Aaron Burr, who is, after all, the descendant of New England Congregationalists, to be president rather than Jefferson. And while Congress is debating on this, there are a couple of other issues that the Congress decides it can do to prevent things from going completely to hell under Jefferson. One is a new Judiciary Act, which creates a new level of federal courts to which we can appoint people who have just lost the election. Remember, one reason the Republicans also have taken control of both houses of Congress. And so some of these Federalists who are voting for Aaron Burr know they are going to be out of work in a few weeks. And so they pass a Judiciary Act, and President Adams is busy appointing people to the federal judgeships who otherwise would be out of work. Jefferson sees this as a partisan thing. He said the Federalists are retiring into the judiciary as a phalanx. And meanwhile, you have the standoff, not knowing who the president is going to be, if Adams is even going to leave. I mean, why would he? There's never been a peaceful transfer of power from one party to an opposition party. And the Federalists don't just see themselves as a political party. They're the guys who have been running the government for 12 years. The other guys have been against everything they have tried to do. They want to weaken the country. The president of Yale says that our wives and daughters are going to be thrown into the stews. We're going to have the French Revolution here. Can the imagination picture anything worse this side of hell? It's not just that we think this guy might have some bad policies. This is going to ruin the country if Jefferson becomes president. I know I'm maybe needlessly alarming you, but about the prospects of this. But this is politics. So, and by the way, in the midst of all of this, just as another thing to remember, back in December, Oliver Wolcott, the Chief Justice, had told President Adams he no longer wanted to be Chief Justice. So Adams had to appoint a new Chief Justice. He has to get that done before he leaves office. Yeah, there had been an election. He had lost, but he is president until March 4th. So first he tries to convince John Jay that he should become Chief Justice, and John Jay says, no thanks. And then he asks someone else, I think it might have been John Rutledge of South Carolina, if he would want to be Chief Justice, and Rutledge says, no thanks. Now remember, in order for someone to become Chief Justice, President Adams has to appoint him, and then the Senate has to confirm him. And it's early February. The votes have already been counted. The House of Representatives is deliberating on who should be president. And Secretary of State Marshall brings in the letter he's just gotten from the latest person to turn down an appointment to be Chief Justice. And Adams knows the clock is really ticking here. He has like 3 weeks to appoint someone and have that person confirmed before he leaves office. And Adams, according to the report, looks at the letter, looks at Marshall, and says, I suppose I have to appoint you. Because he can't wait 2 weeks to hear from Marshall about whether he wants the job or not. So President Adams does appoint John Marshall, who is confirmed by the Senate and will be the Chief Justice for the next 35 years. So, meanwhile, in the House of Representatives, in the third week of February, one of the congressmen from Delaware casts a blank vote, which means the state does not go for Burr. The South Carolina also casts a blank vote. The Federalists in Maryland do the same thing. And the Federalist congressman from Vermont also does so. So now 9 states have voted for Thomas Jefferson, who is elected president of the United States. Now, the guy who's really doing the work in the House of Representatives to make sure all the Republicans keep voting for Jefferson, and any Federalist you can convince to do so will not vote, is Albert Gallatin, who writes that this is the last mad attempt of the Federalists to hold onto power by making Burr the president. And it's still unclear what is going to happen on the 4th of March. That is, will President Adams leave peacefully, or will there be some attempt by the Federalists to hold on to power? Will there be the equivalent of a coup d'etat so the Federalists won't have to leave, knowing how bad they think things are going to be under Jefferson? And President Adams does leave. He actually leaves before the sun is up on March 4th. He does not stay around to see Jefferson inaugurate. As I said, he always likes to get home in a hurry when he doesn't have to be there. And on the morning of March 4th, Chief Justice Marshall was writing actually to Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. And Marshall knew at noon he had to go over to the Capitol and administer the oath of office to Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was Marshall's distant cousin. These two guys had both been law pupils of George Wythe, one of the leading legal scholars in the United States. Actually, it's one of only 2 people in the English-speaking world to hold a chair in the law. The other was William Blackstone. And Wythe had these many law pupils. Jefferson and Marshall were definitely his star pupils, and these 2 guys really hated each other. It was a visceral dislike that Marshall and Jefferson had for each other. And here is John Marshall having to go administer the oath of office to Thomas Jefferson. And he wrote to Pinckney, I wish more than I hope that the public prosperity and happiness will sustain no diminution under Democratic guidance. Okay, so he hopes the public prosperity and happiness don't go down. The Democrats are divided into speculative theorists and absolute terrorists. With the latter, I am not disposed to class Mr. Jefferson. So he really doesn't see a good outcome for this. Nonetheless, he does go to the Capitol, and meanwhile, Vice President Jefferson walks from his boarding house to the Capitol, and at noon, the Chief Justice administers the oath of office to President Jefferson, and Jefferson then reads his inaugural address. Now, in the history of the country, we know that there have been 45 people who have held the office of president. Each one of them is given an inaugural address. And to my mind, there aren't that many that are really worth remembering. But Jefferson's is one. And you have to think about this particular moment when he took the oath of office. That is, the opposition saw this as the end of the republic. They saw his party bent on destroying this union of the states and instituting something like the French Revolution here. Meanwhile, his party saw the other as intent on creating an American monarchy and centralizing power in the executive branch. And one side had used everything it could to try to undo the election. So it's a particularly difficult, perilous moment for the future of the Republic. And you can imagine one inclination would be on the part of Jefferson and the Republicans, who feel like they've been suppressed now for 12 years, to seek revenge on those who have been suppressing them. So Jefferson's inaugural address, during the contest of opinion through which we have passed, our affairs have sometimes worn the animation of discussions and of exertions has sometimes worn an aspect which might impose on strangers, unused to think freely and to speak and to write what they think. It's amazing. The animation of discussions and exertions, this contest of opinion, and people not used to doing this might not understand it. But this being now decided by the voice of the nation, announced according to the rules of the Constitution, all will, of course, arrange themselves under the will of the law and will unite in common efforts for the common good. All too will bear in mind this sacred principle, that though the will of the majority is in all cases to prevail, that will, to be reasonable, must be rightful. And that will, to be rightful, must be reasonable, that the minority possess their equal rights, which equal law must protect, and to violate would be oppression. Let us then, fellow citizens, unite with one heart and one mind. Let us restore to social intercourse that harmony and affection without which liberty and even life itself are but dreary things. And let us reflect that having banished from our land that religious intolerance under which mankind so long bled and suffered, we have yet gained little if we countenance a political intolerance as wicked and capable of as bitter and bloody persecutions. During the throes and convulsions of the ancient world, during the agonizing spasms of infuriated man seeking through blood and slaughter his long lost liberty, he's talking about the French Revolution, the throes and convulsions of the ancient world, an infuriated man seeking through blood and slaughter his long lost liberty. It was not wonderful that the animation of the billows should reach even this distant and peaceful shore, that this should be more felt and feared by some and less by others, and should divide opinions as to measures of safety. But every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We have called by different names brethren of the same principle. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists. If there be any among us who would wish to dissolve this union, which is what the Federalists said the Republicans wanted to do, or to alter its Republican form, which was what the Federalists said the Republicans wanted to do, let them stand undisturbed as monuments to the safety of which error of opinion may be tolerated, where reason is left free to combat it. I know indeed that some honest men fear that a Republican government cannot be strong, that this government will not be strong enough. But would the honest patriot, in the full tide of successful experiment, abandon a government which has so far kept us free and firm on the theoretic and visionary fear that this government, the world's best hope, may, by possibility, want energy to preserve itself? This is a wonderful Jeffersonian sentence. He has this tendency of asking a rhetorical question like this that has only one answer, and saying that he feels this government is the strong. He goes on to say, I believe, on the contrary, this government is the strongest on earth. I believe it is the only one where every man at the call of the law would fly to the standard of the law and would meet invasions of the public order as his own personal concern. So he's explaining you don't need a Sedition Act or a standing army. The strength of the country comes from this attachment each citizen has to the rule of law, the only one where every man at the call of the law would meet invasions of the public order as his own personal concern. Sometimes it is said that man cannot be trusted with the government of himself. Can he then be trusted with the government of others? Or have we found angels in the form of kings to govern him? Let history answer this question. So this is a statement of the meaning of the American Republic. And then Jefferson goes on to talk about what what in particular his administration will do. And I'm spending some time on this because this actually becomes the governing principle of the United States for the next half century. Let us then, with courage and confidence, pursue our own federal and republican principles, our attachment to union and representative government, kindly separated by nature and a wide ocean from the exterminating havoc of 1/4 of the globe, too high-minded to endure the degradation of the others, possessing a chosen country with room enough for our descendants to the thousandth and thousandth generation, entertaining a due sense of our equal rights to the use of our own faculties, to the acquisitions of our own industry, to honor and confidence from our fellow citizens, resulting not from birth, but from our actions and their sense of them. Enlightened by a benign religion, professed indeed and practiced in various forms, yet all of them inculcating honesty, truth, temperance, gratitude, and the love of man. Acknowledging and adoring and overruling providence, which by all its dispensations proves that it delights in the happiness of man here and his greater happiness hereafter. With all these blessings, what more is necessary to make us a happy and prosperous people? Still one thing more, fellow citizens, a wise and frugal government, which shall restrain men from injuring one another, shall leave them otherwise free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement, and shall not take from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned. This is the sum of good government, and this is necessary to close the circle of our felicities. About to enter, fellow citizens, on the exercise of duties which comprehend everything dear and valuable to you, it is proper you should understand what I deem the essential principles of our government, and consequently those which ought to shape its administration. I'll compress them within the narrowest compass they will bear, stating the general principle, but not all its limitations. Equal and exact justice to all men of whatever state or persuasion, religious or political. Peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. The support of the state governments in all their rights as the most competent administrations for our domestic concerns and the surest bulwarks against anti-republican tendencies. The preservation of the general government in its whole constitutional vigor as the sheet anchor of our peace at home and prosperity abroad. A jealous care of the right of election by the people, a mild and safe corrective of abuses which are lopped by the sword of revolution where peaceable remedies are unprovided. Absolute acquiescence in the decisions of the majority, the vital principle of republics, from which is no appeal but to force, the vital principle and immediate parent of despotism. A well-disciplined militia, our best reliance in peace and for the first moments of war till regulars may relieve them. The supremacy of the civil over the military authority. Economy in the public expense that labor may be lightly burdened. The honest payment of our debts, the sacred preservation of the public faith, encouragement of agriculture and of commerce as its handmaid, the diffusion of information and arraignment of all abuses at the bar of public reason, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of person under the protection of habeas corpus, and trial by juries impartially selected. These principles form the bright constellation which has gone before us and guided our steps through an age of revolution and reformation. The wisdom of our sages and blood of our heroes have been devoted to their attainment. They should be the creed of our political faith, the text of civic instruction, the touchstone by which to try the services of those we trust. And should we wander from them in moments of error or of alarm, let us hasten to retrace our steps and to regain the road which alone leads to peace, liberty, and safety. So Jefferson is committing himself and the government to being a wise and frugal government, which will restrain men from injuring one another, but otherwise leave them free to pursue their own happiness and prosperity. And this, as I said, becomes the governing faith of the nation for the next half century. So the big thing Jefferson wants to do, since Adams left him with peace, is to pay off the national debt. And that is going to be the big thing, and the reason to pay the debt is so that the next generation will not be encumbered with the expenses of his, to leave the next generations free to regulate their own pursuits of industry. So that is Jefferson's inauguration. And this, in some cases, is where I would end the class, seeing this is the culmination of the revolution, but there actually are a few more things we'll be talking about next week, when we'll also be hearing about what you've been doing with your podcasts. So that's it for tonight. And I could go on. In fact, I may just read that to myself again, but that is one of the most extraordinary political statements and well worth remembering. So,
Question.
yes.
So
Ainsley.
you said at the beginning of the class the 7th. My group on Blackboard it says the 17th, which is what my group is
That's what I had thought. So,
That's great. That's so much better.
okay.
I probably
Thank-
just forgot the 1. That's my
Okay.
bad.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, so the 17th it is.
Okay.
Very good. Okay, good. So it gives you more time.
Yes, that'd be great.
Okay. So I will see you next time.
Thank
Have a
you.
good night, Professor.
You too. Take care, Jake. Take care, everyone.